Good morning, or good afternoon, or good day, depending on which time zone you're in. I'm delighted to welcome you to this University of Bath School of Management MBA Masterclass entitled Driving Success Through Good Project Management. My name is Donald Lancaster, and I'm Director of Teaching for the MBA programs at Bath, so I'm responsible for the strategic development and academic oversight of our MBAs. And I have to say, I'm really pleased that so many of you have expressed such interest in studying with us. Just before we start, I wonder if I can point out the Q&A button at the top of your screen. Please use it. At any time through this webinar, you can just type in any questions you have, either about careers or about Professor Brandon Jones's research or the MBA programs more widely. And we'll have plenty of time to answer your questions at the end. And in addition, we'll hear also from Becky Gallagher, who is the school's MBA recruitment manager, to whom you may ask questions via the Q&A function about joining or whatever. People join our MBA programs for diverse reasons, but almost inevitably, project management is a relevant subject for them. Right from the start of any career, understanding and clarifying the objectives of a project is critical to its successful completion. On the MBA program, you will undertake many projects. Indeed, a unique facet of the Bath MBA is what we call the multi-project suite on the full-time program. And good project management skills will go a long way towards achieving your degree. It's not that easy to get onto the Bath MBA, a project in itself, you could say. So in that project, you're really the main stakeholder. And by being here, listening and sharpening those skills, you're taking an important and helpful step forwards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alistair Brandon Jones to this virtual program. And I should say Alistair is Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management and the head of the Information Decisions and Operations Division here at Bath University's School of Management. He's also a visiting professor for Hult International Business School and the Danish Technical University. Between 2014 and 17, he was Associate Dean for Post-Experience Education at Bath and therefore responsible for the MBA and the EMBA and the DBA programs as well. He was formerly a reader at Manchester Business School, an assistant and associate professor at Bath, and a teaching fellow at Warwick, where he also completed his PhD. And Alistair's gone on to become co-author of the world's leading series of operations and supply chain management textbooks, and is recognized globally as a leading expert in this subject. So we're really lucky and appreciative to have you with us today, Alistair, to talk about project management as opposed to ops and supply chain, which you would do more of in class. But I, for one, am really excited to hear what you have to say.
All right, well, thank you very much, Don, and thank you everybody for coming along today. That's quite a grand build-up for me. I feel somewhat overwhelmed. So that's really nice. You never quite know what people are going to say or whether they're just going to hand over. So yes, it's great to be here. So as Don says, this is a kind of an interesting challenge in of itself, running a masterclass, because in some ways I've got a few things in my mind to try and achieve. The first is to give you a little bit of a flavour of the kind of faculty who are involved with the MBA and how we approach things, and that we're approachable and friendly and engaged. And of course, some of that is hopefully achievable by the fact I'm smiling at you and I don't look too miserable. But of course, some of it is very hard to replicate, because right now we're not in the environment that we will be in when we're teaching in the class, where we have a huge amount of opportunities for different forms of interaction, for immersive learning, where if I was doing something like a project session, I could be getting you to build some paper towers for me and then talking about how you did it and getting energy in the room. So in some ways, this is a false example of reality. If you like this, I think you'll really like the real MBA in many respects. Similarly, you know, because of the size or the number of attendees on things like this, then it becomes harder to run things like breakout rooms and everything else. And so, because we have people who are literally just running through on a on a web server and so forth, there are limits to what we can do, even relative to when we've had virtual sessions on the MBA where we do quite a lot more, I guess, in the way of bringing alive the session. So that's kind of a note, and it's not to say, hey folks, this is just going to be really boring, so get ready for that. It's just to kind of manage those expectations, I suppose. A second thing to say is clearly there is a balancing act here between bringing content that I will share with you when I'm teaching you managing operations and supply networks as the core course, or potentially if you're doing a supply chain elective, or if you're doing other electives that I'm involved with, or my colleagues are involved with. So there are parts of what I touch on here today that kind of link in, but they link more into the discussions that we have. When I'm teaching around operations management, of course, I'm covering a much broader set of activity than project management. In some ways, we can think of project management as a kind of low volume, high variety part of the operations management space. And of course, when I'm teaching on the core course of managing operations and supply networks, I'm broadening that out to all forms of operations, be they kind of one-off in this kind of context, or be they much more kind of steady state, and everything in between. But Don is absolutely right that project management, in a sense, sits at the core of the whole MBA program. Because of the multi-project suite, you are doing projects and you are engaging with them. You are doing work on the consulting project, and then you are basically figuring out who are the stakeholders, how do I brief this, how do I manage expectations around time, cost, and quality. How do I think about dealing with problems as I go along in these different projects? And so in a sense, with project management, we don't actually have a core unit on project management because we immerse it in the program in other ways. And that was very much kind of some of the core ideas with the program as we have made significant changes to the program over several years. So I hope that just gives you a little bit of a flavour of what I guess I'm trying to achieve in today's masterclass. Now, another thing to say, of course, is a masterclass implies that I'm the oracle and I know what I'm talking about, and everybody here just can listen to me and be wowed by it, which might be a nice way to think. And given what Don said about the books and everything else, you might be feeling that that's what should happen. But of course, MBAs are not like that. They're a co-produced product. I sometimes liken an MBA much more to deciding to invest in a world-class gym with world-class trainers. You still have to do the work. You know, if you don't show up, if you don't actually put the energy in, then basically you shouldn't be coming. It's pointless. And however brilliant our facilities are, literally physical facilities or tech facilities, however brilliant our resources are in terms of great professors, great professional support staff, excellent careers advice, etc. If you basically don't put the effort in and go to the gym on a daily basis and try hard, you're wasting your time, frankly. And that narrative comes through in the way we teach, because it means you won't walk into a class and sit there for 3 hours and be talked at. You will, ironically, in this masterclass to some extent, and that's why it's important to kind of distinguish. In the classes, you will be expected to give a lot of yourself, give a lot of your ideas into the mix, because in many respects, on an MBA, more than any other program within business schools and management schools, you are experts as well as us. You're experts in different ways. You perhaps have way higher knowledge of a particular context, a particular sector, a particular type of work. Some of you are, really high-end finance managers, and so you know a particular part more, frankly, than even the lecturer will. I mean, not every lecturer would like me to say that, but that is simply the truth. But there'll be other parts that you have a blind spot with. And importantly, when you're sort of working on MBAs, much of your job then becomes, how do you bring your expertise, share it, but in a collegiate way? So not sit back in a finance session and say, well, I know this already, so I don't need to pay attention, or, oh, I've done operations management before, so I don't really need to engage because I know this stuff. Actually, you're even more important for your classmates, because you're then sharing your expertise and bringing up the class. And we are not really competitive as a program amongst each other in some respects, because our aim is, as a cohort, to get everyone to win by helping each other out rather than beating each other down. And again, that's something that's really, really important with the culture of the Bath MBA. It's actually somewhat different from some other MBAs that can become a little bit of I win, someone else loses kind of mindset. That's not the case. So that's a little bit of a sort of introduction about what this session should be about. And then a little bit of kind of about me. Don's kind of told you sort of what I am now. I'm the head of division for the IDEO division. That we have 4 divisions in the School of Management. So information systems, decisions and operations management sort of covers various aspects of operations research, business analytics, data science, empirical operations and supply chain, project management, information systems, etc. I'm always wary here because if I have a colleague who happens to be on this call, they'll be going, "You forgot my specialism," but you get the broad idea, right? So that's kind of one of my jobs, but I also research still very actively in operations and supply chain, particularly in 2 areas. One in digitization of supply chain and operations. I've been doing that kind of work for the last 20 years. And secondly, kind of with a very behavioral angle, so often working with professional service operations, kind of quite complex operations, not the sort of steady state, high volume, high variety type operations, to try and kind of explore how can you apply operations ideas in more behavioral ways. So if I'm looking at implementation of systems, for example, I'll talk a lot about the people involved in that process rather than simply the technical challenge. And I mention that partly in passing because it gives you a flavour of what I am, but also because it will give some context to this particular session. When you look at project management as it's taught, often it's taught as a relatively technical subject. Now, in some ways, that's because its origins come from sort of engineering background, very often from the construction sector, and it's often seen to an extent in a fairly technical way. And of course, there are very technical elements of project management that are very important. But ultimately, project management is also about sociodynamics. It's also about understanding stakeholders. It's also about understanding behaviors and influence and negotiation, etc. So there again is another really great thing about doing an MBA is the skills you might be learning when you're doing consulting and action, the skills you might be learning when you're doing a strategy course, the skills you might be learning when you're learning about marketing and how to brand actually resonate when you're doing projects. Because if you're good at marketing and communication and inspiring people to want to do something, actually you've got a really good set of skills to work on consultation exercises with stakeholders or influencing opposition to projects and gaining resources, etc. So that leads me to another point, and in a way what I'm doing here before I sort of go into the masterclass itself, which starts in essentially 2 minutes, is to kind of give you a framing for how you think about the program as well. The MBA, in some respects, inevitably, like all programs, we have to define units or modules or courses, whatever you want to call them, across a program. And so in some ways, programs create artificial boundaries in people's minds because they go, oh, I've done marketing and that relates to this part of the world, and I've done operations and supply networks, that's that, and finance and accounting and strategy and so forth. But of course, we know that one of the reasons so many organizations are not successful or are successful is based on the extent to which they break those boundaries down, they work across teams, they're more collaborative, etc. And so I hope that this session will give you a sense of how those ideas resonate, because projects, more than anything else, are a tool, and thinking about projects are a tool to really understand how issues of strategy, of marketing, of financing, of engagement with your employees, with key stakeholders, of engagement with your supply network, of engagement with your customers, how they all really come together in a really powerful way. So that's a sort of a final primer before I now start sharing some slides with you. Let's get on to the sort of, that was like an aperitif. Here's the main course. So what I'm going to do is over the next kind of hour or so, we're going to work our way through some of these ideas of how can we drive success through good project management. I'm going to try and take a really positive attitude to this. And I say that with a slight smirk because for many of you, you will have experienced projects that have gone wrong in various ways. They've been delayed, they've run over budget, they've had arguments between stakeholders, they've had quality problems, etc. And that is just the reality. And I'll talk a bit about why that might be the case. But it's also important to acknowledge that, you know, there are lots of projects that go really well, and they go really well because sometimes they just get lucky, of course. But also they often go well because those people engaged with running them have really understood the project. They've really understood the different stakeholders and how you might organize effective forms of communication with those different stakeholders, how you might achieve buy-in, how you might deal with potential risks, etc. They've also been, in a sense, realistic about the fact that if you are doing a project and you think everything will go well, then you're setting yourself up for a failure. So they've factored in the risks in advance in an effective manner, rather than hoped for the best and then dealt with the worst. So in this session, really, we're going to kind of cover a few key ideas. And as Don said at the start, I really encourage people to sort of post in questions as we go along. There'll be a couple of points where actually specifically we'll ask you to put into your ideas, and then I will either get Don or Alan or others will essentially shout at me when there are questions coming through, because when I'm teaching, sometimes I'm not seeing the feed in the same way, and certainly because I'm teaching, I don't necessarily notice it. That, of course, is a point about a classroom setting versus online. When you're in the class, you can spot people's hands more easily. All right, so the agenda for today, then, we're going to think a little bit about what projects are, which might sound obvious, but you'll perhaps see in a second why perhaps it's slightly less so, and what project management matters so much. And then I'm going to cover 3 core ideas as to what makes projects so hard, why so many projects fail, and how we can kind of start to overcome that by understanding better the innate characteristics of projects and the important aspects of differentiating projects. Secondly, issues of how can we understand the management of project process and project people. And then finally, how can we think about project learning, an often underplayed issue in a lot of projects. So this first slide is to try and get you thinking. It's to get you thinking about what the word projects mean to you. So very often when I am in class with a group of people and teaching them specifically project management, I'll just play a word game. I say project, you say. So think about that right now. I say project, you say. What do you say? What are the key words that come to your mind? As you're just thinking about that for a second, word association game, if you will, many people will naturally default to certain kinds of projects in their mind. And they will probably have in their mind projects that they see in the media, i.e. large construction projects, big IT projects. They're often 2 of the sort of most common projects that get talked about a lot. And they get talked about a lot because they are big, expensive, controversial, and often are failing badly. The other thing, of course, is when I walk down the street and I see a great big building that is still not finished, I notice it because it's physical. And so failure is very evident when it comes to building a bridge, building a tower, building a new, a new home, a new kitchen, whatever it might be, whatever scale, in a sense. The physicality of that project makes it easier to understand what's going wrong compared with an organizational change project, for example, the implementation of a new hiring and talent recruitment process. Some of the branding projects we do, they're less obviously successful or fail because there's sort of data behind the scenes that's saying, yeah, we're getting a really good click rate on this particular new website that we've developed, for example, but it's not so obvious as walking down and going, God, that tower still hasn't been finished and what's going on, and it doesn't seem that there's not much going on here. So delays become more apparent. Cost overruns also become apparent because often it's taxpayers who are paying for some of this, and so the media get engaged with those projects in a way that they perhaps don't with some others. So there's reasons why we naturally will focus on certain kinds of projects. There are also other reasons, which is when we think about those who write on project management, research on project management, talk about project management, very often they come from particular settings. And, the construction industry is one of those settings that has a very dominant voice in project management discourse. Similarly, the IT sort of sector, if you will, and big systems infrastructure projects have a very dominant voice in the conversation, whereas you don't tend to hear so much about successful or less successful movies, and yet of course they're projects. You don't hear maybe so much about some of the ongoing R&D projects or commercial service design projects unless you start looking. And of course, when you start looking, you realize that projects are literally everywhere. We are all involved in projects in all sorts of ways, running small projects, affected by projects, part of teams of projects, or perhaps simply being able to observe them. So I would encourage this, and I encourage this when it comes to any subject on an MBA, which is just to start really paying attention to the stuff that's going on around you, beyond your own organization and beyond your own experiences. Because once you start looking, you'll see any number of examples that you can apply the ideas that one covers in different topic areas. So projects are really everywhere, and they're much more diverse, I think, than often initially people will consider. Now, I say that cautiously because in some respects, bluntly, the more experienced you are, the less of a surprise the idea of projects being more than simply tower building and bridge building becomes. So, when you're talking to MBAs, you get this, but I think it's still worth re-emphasizing that just because you might be working on predominantly, systems implementation projects in your organization, or just because you might predominantly be working in an HR function where the project is predominantly around talent recruitment and retention, projects from other places can be really, really useful to think about. And so one of the things we often get asked by MBAs is, look, I work in the FMCG space. So what can I really learn from shipping, let's say? And the simple answer is a lot, because actually very often similarities across industries can actually be greater than similarities between industries. If you are a high-end bespoke producer of kitchens where every single kitchen is different for your clients and there's huge amounts of interaction and design work, and you're producing in volumes that are very small, varieties that are very high, lots of interaction with the customer, so high levels of visibility, for example, you look fundamentally different from a mass manufacturing kitchen company over here that are producing a standard set of 3 outputs, and they're producing hundreds of thousands of units of it. So in effect, although you're both technically kitchen manufacturers, your world is totally different. One is highly project oriented and one is actually much more sort of steady state operations oriented. So what do you do if you are that bespoke high-end producer of kitchens? Well, you could start to look at, well, how do architects work with clients? How do lawyers work with clients? How do consultancy firms work with clients? Because in a sense, they're dealing in perhaps quite similar types of characteristics in terms of volume and variety and variation in demand and visibility, for example. So that's a thing, again, to push this idea of looking outside of your sector for ideas for innovation when you're benchmarking. I always tell the story when I'm talking about failure and recovery of Singapore Airlines. Singapore Airlines increasingly don't benchmark against other airlines because basically they're really good. And they're saying, well, what we need to do is we need to change the benchmark when we're trying to make improvements for sort of improvement projects. We need to look at who's the best for a certain type of thing. So if we've got, service check-in desks at the airports, what are our business customers, first class customers, how are they comparing us? They're not comparing us just with the check-in of other airlines. They're actually comparing us with check-in at the really nice hotel, the Shangri-La hotel that they stayed at the day before. And they're saying, what kind of experience did I get at that kind of check-in versus your kind of check-in? And is that comparable? Similarly with the food. If I'm flying first class on Singapore Airlines, I'm not really comparing it necessarily with just other airline food. I'm comparing it with that restaurant I went to the day before that was maybe a 1-star Michelin restaurant. And I'm going, well, this food isn't as good. Now, of course, it's hard to make food as good as that when you're flying at 20,000 feet. But that's basically what Singapore Airlines are attempting to do. They're attempting to say we could be better because we can look beyond our own sector for inspiration. So that's kind of, again, a broader point to think about when we look at projects. Looking outside of your sector helps. It's useful. Now, hopefully I've kind of got your thinking going here. And I want you to think about this question of, have you ever managed a project? And if so, think about how it went. Think about the kinds of projects you participated in, and think about, was it a success or a failure? How and why? And on this, I want you, as many of you as are willing to and able to and happy to type some ideas and thoughts into the chat as we now go through this next section, and I'll then encourage Don to sort of shout out some of the kind of comments as they come in. Now, there's always a slight time lag on this between me saying it and then people typing it and then it coming through. There's usually a kind of a pause. So as people are doing that, I'm going to kind of carry on, but think about this question. Projects that you've worked on, when you think about them, what's made them successful or unsuccessful? What have been the key issues that you have faced in projects? And those projects could be big or small. They could be projects that you've run in the work setting, or they could be projects you've run at home. I'm currently with my wife in literally about to start the next phase of a large house project at home. We're going to be knocking through our kitchen dining room and doing some extension work. And there's the little bit of me, of course, that sort of chuckles, because I know that my wife, who, by the way, is also an expert in operations and supply chain, very much from sort of sustainability perspectives, but I know that she will be calling me out when things go wrong, because she'll say, hang on a minute, you're meant to be an expert in this, so the expectation is very high in that sense for the client. So
just very briefly, I think people need to put their suggestions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box.
Yes, sorry, the Q&A box. Thank you, Don. Yeah. So think about that question now. So I'm just going to unshare for a moment, partly because it kind of signals that this is a meaningful query and question I'm asking of you. Okay, so Shada, thank you so much for starting. So Shada gets a point for being one of the first on. So failures, not enough information known at the start, not tracking regularly, really great points there. So, this idea that the better we can front load the work in terms of planning projects, in terms of engaging with a better project briefing, really spending the time thinking about what are the project objectives, is really well made, Shada. And yet, if we think about the pressures from clients in projects, often it is to crack on. It's to get on with it. I was working on a project several years ago for a major program review at an institution that will remain nameless, and working away on doing lots of kind of groundwork, really understanding different perspectives so we could really frame the work. And my boss at the time sort of said, well, when are you going to start? Al, when are you going to start this project? It's like, well, we already have started it. This is part of the project. But I think in a sense, the perspective coming through there was this idea of, but I haven't really seen anything yet. Nothing tangible has happened. You think about physically why often builders like to sort of turn up and dig some trenches. Well, it's because they want to show that sort of there's progress. And yet, ironically, spending a few more weeks or months really planning the sequence of activities might solve all sorts of problems down the line. So that pressure to move often means we don't feel we have enough time to collect information at the start. And then Shada's point about, not tracking regularly enough, right? So actually, how do you get better ongoing monitoring and intervention as you go through a project? How do you essentially decide if your project is already starting to stray in terms of time or cost or deliverables, and what you're going to do to kind of bring that round? Great stuff. Bogdan's made a nice point as well. So thinking about something as a project should be limited in time. Otherwise, it would be a product. For example, difference between change and transformation. Could you clarify that? Yeah, Bogdan, great point. So one of the things I get asked quite a lot is, like, when does a project not a project? How do you determine the fundamentals of what a project is? So in some ways, we can think about projects in broad terms as kind of having commonalities, right? They have constrained time periods, as in they have a definite start and an end. So if something is literally an ongoing thing, it is by definition not a project. Now, of course, that raises some interesting issues when we think about operations management more broadly, which is much of what we do as individuals is a combination of steady state stuff and small projects that we regularly do. I might have summer projects with MBAs, and I do that every summer. They are projects, and I support that. And so I am in a project in that sense, alongside you as an MBA. And then I'll say, well, that's been great. And then I will do the same thing the following year. I will teach an operations course, or a supply chain course, or a project management course, or an ops strategy course. That is a project because it has a kind of defined start and finish. And yet I'm doing it more than once ever in my life. And so I'm clearly going to be building on previous iterations. So there is a subtle difference, I think, between very low volume, high variety operations and projects. And in some senses, when you think about this idea of a scale from mass production, mass services to kind of job shops in service settings, for example, or batch production, if we're talking about manufacturing settings, up into kind of pure project space, it is much more on a kind of on a spread rather than definitely it's one or the other. So that's kind of something that one could think about there. Let me just have a look at some others. We've got published.
We've got a whole load there.
I'm just looking. I can't see. Yes, sorry. Yes, they've all come up there. They sort of, there's a little thing, and then they've all come through. So buy-in. So this is Bogdan again. Buy-in of other people, their advocacy, engagement, collaboration, the availability of talent. Brilliant stuff from Bogdan there. Really great points. So something around this idea of projects are fundamentally at the core a collection of knowledge assets as much as anything else. Now, of course, you've also got to go and buy your physical machinery if you're building something. You've got to go and buy lab time if you're doing an R&D project. You've got to go and hire people to do certain kinds of work. But often a lot of the projects that you as MBAs will be involved in are relatively more intangible resources, knowledge, people-based resources than they are actually the physical infrastructure. And/or often it's the people part that is the harder to resource and to get, the availability of talent, more than it is to go and hire the machinery. Of course, there are constraints right now with many projects where they can't get the physical assets. They've got the people, but they don't actually have the stuff they need because of various supply chain challenges as a result of either COVID or Brexit or the Ukraine conflict, etc. So we operate in a very challenging macro environment for projects right now in many cases. It's partly, of course, why I'm always slightly conflicted when really bad things are happening in the world in terms of things like COVID, because they represent real challenges for organizations, but they also frankly highlight the critical importance of good operations, of good supply chain, of good project management. And so in a sense, as a discipline, they remind people of the importance of our discipline. Often when things are going really well, people forget about the importance of operations and supply chain and projects, because it's kind of like you notice them when they go wrong. I talk about this idea when you go to an airport, and if everything goes smoothly, you kind of just take it for granted. It's when you have a problem that you start to notice the operations. It's when you start to notice the supply chain problems is when they emerge. And so sometimes we almost have to be reminded of these issues. From Anonymous, successful projects have clear scope, budget, clarity of roles. Really nice point. So, something about the way in which successful projects really take the time to develop clarity when it comes to what it is you want, who's doing it, what are the timelines, what are the exclusions, what are the deliverables, what are the technical requirements of this project, what are the key milestones that we're going to assess progress against. So that planning space becomes really important. Being really clear about whose responsibility is it to do this thing, and this thing within a project, and especially as those projects become more and more complex. So thinking about good planning, thinking about the context, as Joe's talked about, the idea of how we get kind of deal with different clients and contractors who are flexible enough, and so understanding the kind of needs of when you outsource work, are you confident that that work can be done as you expect? Something I talk about a lot when I'm talking about supply chain is the ideas of principal and agents. So, the buyer supplier in that particular example of how do you ensure that the agent is operating in the way that you want them to? How do you manage information asymmetries, disinformation? How do you manage to monitor, incentivize, How do you ensure that you have a mindset that when things go wrong, often it's not because the supplier has cut corners and acted opportunistically, it's because you as a principal, as a buyer of service, haven't been clear what you wanted. So kind of quite a different mindset to some of these project settings, for example. Shada, good relationships with customers. So, you know, there's so much work that colleagues of mine do in managing the client relationship, especially around sort of marketing work and communication work across this program, that really resonate here when we talk about the managing those kind of key relationships. Reflection post a failure, great point. So, you know, actually spending the time thinking about what went wrong in a previous project gives us a fighting chance to put it right for next time. And yet, as I'll come later on in this session, so often we don't see that. So often we see a mindset that says, it was really bad, let's just forget about it and let's all move on. And frankly, you know, if Don and myself and Becky and Clem have been working on a project that's going really badly, we all can't stand each other, we all blame each other. And so the last thing we want to do is sit in a room and discuss what went wrong and do lessons learned. And yet actually that's what we need to do. We actually need to do that work. And if we don't, we basically repeat the errors in the future when either we come back together or another group comes back together with us involved. Liagas made a really nice point about mission creep in R&D projects. So not spending enough time up front means that often you then end up having arguments essentially about what's in and what's out. I've seen this a lot, for example, in consulting projects that I have a consulting sort of company and do lots of bits of work on this. And you see that kind of idea of the disconnect between a client's assumptions of what was included in the price and your assumptions of what was included in the price. IT systems often have this in projects where training has been assumed to be included by the buyer, and yet the technology provider says, well, no, that's a separate piece of work. And of course, if that hasn't been clarified, you get a lot of bad feeling occurring. Working in silos, assuming members don't have the skills to support, really great point there. Ben, failure due to required outcomes changing. Of course, you know, one of the biggest challenges is projects by definition are volatile environments. You know, we talk about VUCA environment, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, as a kind of general challenge of business, right? But in some senses, that's a bit simplistic because it implies that sort of everyone has an equal level of VUCA. You know, it's like everyone's wading through a VUCA environment around them. Well, of course, that's not quite the case because in some settings, actually, demand is quite stable. I mean, I was doing some stuff earlier on about, you know, demand patterns, and, you know, sometimes demand for services and products is quite stable over time. We have fairly predictable supply that's quite reliable. We have well-established partnerships, etc., etc. So it's not that our life is just totally easy, but it's certainly a whole lot easier than some of the kind of dynamic, complex, very challenging project environments that one finds oneself in as well. And so this idea of the kind of changing outcomes and requirements really resonates in a project setting particularly. All right. Hi, Alistair. Agreeing with the requirements at the start, not changing them except through discipline, change management, then formal holding to account. Really nice points. So, you know, one of the challenges I think to that anonymous comment is that we have to be willing sometimes to hold our clients to account, to actually say, look, Don, if you do want this change, that's fine, but there is an implication. If you want to make this change now, that means that there is going to be a delay, or there's going to be a cost, or we're going to have to make a compromise somewhere else. Is that what you want? If you do, that's fine. Let's now in a sense, refine the project scope and agree a slightly different, say, timeline or cost or whatever it is, rather than simply what we often find is those who are client facing say, yeah, Don, fine, I'm sure it'll be all right. And then they go to the people actually doing it and say, yeah, the client wants it in blue, or the client wants it in a different setup, or the client wants, you know, we said we were going to do a little bit of training for just that initial group, but actually they want a bit more, but I'm sure we can make it work. Just make it work. And so we speak to this idea of kind of disconnects between marketing and operations, between marketing and projects, right? The way in which project management is essentially an interdisciplinary piece of activity that incorporates naturally front-facing marketing colleagues and essentially kind of internal and supply-facing operations colleagues, let's say, in simple terms. And so that creates all sorts of problems. So there is an irony here. Sometimes when we talk about kind of, conflict between players in a system, we imagine sort of the organization as a single entity who will get on, and the problems are dealing with these external clients that are really unreasonable, or this supplier who keeps on failing us. Often the real conflicts in projects are within the organization, within the project team, because people have such different views. All right, so I'm not going to go into all of them, so apologies to people like Mark at the bottom end around sort of lack of alignment with success. These are all really good points, but I'm going to kind of carry on a bit now. Some brilliant inputs into the commentary there. All of those ideas really speak to, I think, the genuine challenge of running good projects, because we are essentially constantly trying to balance priorities. This classic iron triangle view of projects, which of course has critique, which I can get into on another occasion over a coffee or a lunch break on the MBA. But in projects, we can often think of this idea of project management being about managing trade-offs, and inevitably, as we improve one form of performance, say quality performance goes up, we are reducing the performance in terms of time and cost, i.e. we are increasing costs because cost performance is increasing costs, or we are making time longer. So these are measures of performance. Similarly, if we want to speed up time, i.e. improve time performance, well then often we're having to make compromises by spending more or by reducing the specification. And then obviously if we want to save money, often that means we end up having to cut quality, reduce quality performance, or potentially find more time to play with to let the project happen at a more leisurely pace where the cost might be cheaper. Now, we've talked quite a lot in a way in our reflections of both projects that have gone well for us and why, and projects that haven't gone well and why. And of course, there's an irony here that the themes in effect are mirrored themes in many cases. I planned a project brilliantly, it went well. I didn't plan enough, or I saw a project not planned well enough, it went badly. I did engage with the key players effectively, or I didn't. So many of these themes kind of resonate on both sides of the equation of successful or less successful projects. But I want to kind of give an idea to sort of build out from that. When we think about projects, really big projects that have been failures in one form, and I say that cautiously, of course. We can look back at back at history of things like the Opera House in Sydney, and we can say, well, from a project management perspective, it was a failure. It was a very it went over time and budget and everything else. But actually, people might look back now and go, well, you know what, it's a fantastic, iconic building, and we'll forgive it. And that's fine to a point, but it risks something, which is often when we look back at projects far enough away, we forget just how bad they really were, and therefore we're not taking the opportunity to learn from them. It does also say, of course, that our perceptions of project success are dynamic. They are different for the different players. So, for example, if you have a project, a new IT implementation project that is delivered a month late, for some parties that month is critical, and it's going to, therefore, this project has essentially failed. For some other part of your organization, they might say, well, it doesn't really matter, as long as the quality of this IT system is good, that extra month isn't really that big a deal. So the perceptions are not often a singular client. We have multiple clients, especially in organizational projects. This picture on the right hand side is of my little boy, Noah. He loves projects, as you can imagine, and he likes building trains. And this is a picture I took a few years ago of him building a train. And it makes me smile because it reminds me of how often we are in projects. When you're working on a project, often you're in the devil of the detail. You're in that particular work package. You're really focused. And it's very hard to then step out and look at the big picture. And I remember this because I took a picture of him finishing the train line, and he was so pleased, and he looked up at me and he smiled for about a second, because he thought that this project had been a great success, and he was about to say, look, I've done it, Daddy. And then he saw the cat, that's Millie, one of our numerous cats, sitting on the train line, essentially a project failure in his mind, and he burst into tears. And it was a kind of funny and tragic moments simultaneously. And you always have that sort of choice as a parent. Do you take the photo because it would be good for comedy later on, or do you just go and hug him? And I went and hugged him, and I'm glad I did. But he was really upset by this because, in a sense, in getting so focused on one part of the project, he'd lost sight of the other moving parts of this project. And I'm going to come back to that picture and that idea a little bit more as we go through into some of our further ideas. Now, when we think about these kind of characteristics of projects, then let's again have a tiny exercise just to get you kind of boy a little bit later on. Now he's about 6, and his lovely girlfriend Alicia, they really are super close, and they wanted a Minions party. So Minions from Despicable Me and everything else. I'm sure some of you will have heard of them, and they were really keen that the whole thing would be themed that way. They wanted a bouncy castle, they wanted a nice cake that would be like a minion. They wanted to invite their friends from their school. They also wanted their dads to dress up as minions, which you can probably see on the left hand side of your screen. So when I'm not an MBA teacher and a serious researcher and a professor of great renown, as Don suggested I was, I think you were slightly overstating it, Don, but even so, I'm also a kids entertainer at parties. So it's always good to have a backup plan when it comes to your career in case I ever get fired. So here's the party, and you can see kind of all of the things that were going on. Now, what I want you to do is type into the Q&A, what are some of the key measures of success for this party? What are some of the key stakeholders for this party? Who are the key stakeholders for this party? Beyond Noah and Alicia, there are obvious clients here who we want to keep happy. Who else have we got to think about? What do you think would be some of the key things in my mind and in my wife Emma's mind and SJ and Duncan and Alicia's parents' mind? What do you think some of the key issues would be that they're trying to think about during running a project like this? All right, so I'm just going to again unshare my screen for a bit because it kind of gives you a little bit of a break to think about. So let's see if we've got any ideas for key challenges for this project, key stakeholders for this project. What would success look like for this project? Any ideas, any thoughts? All right, let's have a look. Okay, so Michelle has said, I love the analogy. Well, thank you, Michelle. That's very kind of you. But at the same time, I also want you to give me a bit more. So add something in. Shada said, enough food. Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. So a measure of success is everyone goes away essentially having eaten enough food. But of course, we might also say as a project, a measure of success from me as a supplier of this project is not having wasted a ton of food and thrown it all away. Not simply because we care about sustainability. And by the way, as a side point on the MBA, there's a very strong emphasis on sustainability that runs through all of our program. How can we be successful but also be responsible citizens of the world? But if I was just running this as a project and thinking about it from a cost perspective, I don't want to waste food or drink or other resources. So that's a really nice start point. Okay, keeping the parents engaged, says Shada. Absolutely. So, we tend to think of a kids party, the key stakeholders are the kids, but actually the parents matter as well. So, I've been to parties where the parents are sort of really well looked after and you really feel like there's attention to detail there. And I've been to other ones where it's essentially you just sort of standing around and there's, lots of food and drink for the kids and nothing for you as the parents, and etc. So really nice point there. So we've got parents, we've got kids, we've got the food delivery, we've got the space, Bogdan's highlighted. So thinking about the suppliers, the supplier of the bouncy castle, the supplier of the cake. Now, actually, Michelle, on that point, the cake was actually made by my wife Emma. So I think again, it's good to have backup plans, and I think it's fair to say that on this occasion, she's got a good backup plan there. I reckon she could definitely go into cake making full time if she wanted to. But you're absolutely right, of course. And ironically, part of doing good projects is then deciding what are you going to do yourself. So do you have capability to bake a cake? icing cake, or are you going to outsource that? And what are the pros and cons in terms of cost and quality and hassle of doing that? Right, fair enough. Any other ones? Let's have a look. The total seconds of laughter as a success. That's a brilliant one from one of our anonymous chats. Thank you so much for that. You could, that's really speaks to the idea of how can you metric success in operations, in project settings. What does success look like, and can you agree on that? In fact, anonymous, you've got 4 thumbs up already, so that shows what a good idea that was. Making agile or regular checks on the status of food items. Really nice point from Diksha here. It speaks to the idea, okay, this is a simple project, of course, by comparison with building the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, but the principles are actually basically the same. Is like, what does monitoring and control look like for a project? And in this case, you're absolutely right. Having a system in place where we were regularly checking if there was enough food, enough drinks, and topping up. In fact, we even got into a little bit, rather geekily, of some of the operations poker yoke systems where you have, when you get to your second last bottle of Diet Coke, as that gets picked up, underneath was a little red piece of card. So looking across the room, you can see bits of red card. It's like, we need more drinks, we need more crisps. So we can importantly apply ideas of all of the subjects we cover on an MBA in our personal lives. For those of you who actually do end up coming, I know many of you are coming, so this isn't really a sales pitch, it's more or less like, here's something to look forward to. When we talk about things like inventory management, which might sound like it's going to be really boring, I'll be getting into, how are you managing the inventory of your fridges at home as an exercise, but also as a really kind of important learning point about waste and how can we be better. And then we can extrapolate those ideas up into what does that look like when you're running multiple warehouses around the world, or your Maersk shipping, or whatever else it might be. So there's lots of ways we can think about these ideas. All right, stakeholder engagement, other parents bring their kids. That's right. So are we going to let the kids, brothers and sisters, come? What does that do to the dynamic of the party? How are we going to make that decision? Other dads participate as minions. I wish we had, Michelle. That would have been brilliant. Basically, all the other dads were looking at me and Duncan and just like, what on earth? Like, how did you manage to get talked into this? I went to a party last weekend where basically it was just sitting outside on there was like a cricket ground and deck chairs, lovely sunny weather, chilled out, kids just playing around. And Duncan and I turned to each other and said, never again are we going to be minions at a party. But there we are. Allergy factors from Sean. So again, we're going to about the sort of mission critical information that will determine the success, and safety, of course, absolutely. So we can think about, hey, this will be really fun, and it will therefore increase, to go back to the anonymous comment, of the total seconds of laughter as a success factor. But the problem is, if it goes wrong, we're going to be sending one of the children to accident emergency, the local hospital. So how do we get that balance between wild, crazy party, great for the kids, and slightly calmer, because that's actually the parents are going, this is getting a bit crazy now. And in fact, we did think quite a lot about that, because when you've got 2 lunatic minions running around with kids, there is a very high chance that it can suddenly get out of hand. And so you have to think about, we'll just play some calm music. We'll play Sleeping Statues as a game, as a calming game, if it all starts to get a bit wild. So there was a bit of thought that goes into that. You can start to see what a cool guy I am in terms of my outside life. Basically, I just live and breathe this stuff. And so, I can never just enjoy a nice meal at a restaurant without thinking about their processes. I can never go to the theatre without complaining about the capacity of the toilets. I'm a whole load of fun to be with in that sense. All right. Yes. Let's carry on. Let's carry on through them. So I'm going to reshare my screen again now to build out some of these ideas. So we talked about this idea of, this project and all the projects that you've been thinking about share certain commonalities. They are a temporary organization. Now, those projects might only last hours or days, sometimes weeks, years, decades, but they have a temporality about them that does make them projects as opposed to a steady state. They're dedicated to completing a specific goal within particular time, cost, quality requirements. The outcome is unique, or at the very least highly customized. Now, of course, there are different levels of customization in projects, from somewhat repeat on a theme to truly never been done before. I'm building, the Kingdom Tower in Saudi Arabia. This is a one-off project, highly bespoke. And of course, although it's still building on, to excuse the expression, or other knowledge within construction, it is very challenging from an engineering perspective because you're trying to go a mile up in the air, right? Whereas if I'm, a construction company building another series of domestic homes that look quite similar, and I'm doing a sort of building an estate of new homes, actually a lot of that is very much repetition on a theme. So the level of innovation is much lower. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Projects really involve, therefore, many non-routine, complex tasks. So we can think of projects in this way, but we can also think about how we differentiate them. So if we think about volume and variety in operations, obviously projects sit in the low volume, high variety space. But when you then apply that idea of, but what about within projects? Well, you can kind of take the same idea of some projects being basically low volume, high variety, and some projects being slightly higher variety. They're still low, but they're essentially, somewhat less so than true unique projects, if you take my meaning. Another useful way, and this comes from one of our books with Nigel Slack and Nicola Burgess. So Nigel Slack is, again, somebody who's done huge amounts of work on operations over many decades, and truly does deserve the kind of notes that Don was talking about, being, world renowned in that regard. But we can think about differentiating projects based on levels of innovation, based on the kind of time pressures we face, based on the kind of complexity. So some projects, involve a huge amount of newness, new technical requirements, new ways of doing things. They're really stretching technology, for example. And so as those innovation levels are very high, that makes it much harder to lock down on a particular design. It means that often we don't even know what the market looks like. We don't even know if there is a market. So you have many more iterations of design. So that almost by definition means they are going to either take longer or be more costly. They're going to be certainly more unpredictable. If we think about time pressures, when you have a project where the time isn't really intense, then actually you have time to play with different ideas. It's all relatively straightforward. You can kind of ratify every decision centrally. But when you are really under pressure, it's a very different kind of dynamic that you face, right? So if we think about this recent example, when we had the Ever Given ship stuck in the Suez Canal, literally every day is costing the world economy billions of dollars. In various forms, and causing huge amounts of disruption. So the time pressure here to essentially get this ship unstuck and get this Suez Canal moving again was absolutely intense, and all the resources that could be thrown at it were going to be thrown at it, because in a sense cost was irrelevant. Quality basically is clear. The metric of success is the Suez Canal is open again, and therefore all focus is on as fast as is conceivably possible. So that differentiation idea is really useful because it speaks to the sort of concept, I suppose, that not all projects are the same simply because they conform to the core characteristics of being a project. Some projects are a lot easier than others, but they're easier or harder in different ways. So you might have a project that's not that time pressure, but where you're really trying to stretch innovation. That looks quite different from a project where the innovation level is not that great at all, but you really have a huge amount of time pressure. Compare that with a project which is, relatively small scale. When I'm writing a new book with Nigel and Nicola, the number of key stakeholders and players in that system is relatively small. We kind of know what we're doing. So we might bring quite a lot of innovation, we hope we do, to each edition of the book. We might bring new cases, we might work with other colleagues on that work, new content, etc. But from a complexity perspective, it's a pretty simple project compared with, building the Daxing International Airport in Shanghai, for example, or implementing a major new, 5G network across a country, or whatever else it might be. That then leads us to ideas of like process and of people. So we can also think of project management as managing process, a kind of life cycle view of projects. And so you're working through from kind of initial concept planning, definition, design, implementation, and then conversion, and learning. Now, within that idea, many of the comments that came up earlier in the Q&A about, what went well, what went badly, how could we learn from this, really resonate, because a lot of you talked about this idea of good planning or not good planning. And so one of the ways of thinking about good planning is to think about these 3 core bubbles on your screen here. So the first is scoping the project, and within scoping you have core elements of what are the project objectives? Are you clear and agreed on that? What are the key deliverables? Are you clear and agreed on that? What are the milestones that will allow you to assess progress of a project? What are the technical requirements? What are the constraints? So for example, if you're going to redesign an MBA program or a master's program, some of the technical requirements might link to minimum viable class sizes, because we know that a bit beyond a certain scale, too big, it's hard because we don't get that kind of rich immersive feel, but too small and you don't get that networking effect. So we might say we are going to bracket a size as a formal technical requirement between, I don't know, 40 and 60, whatever it might be. We might say, well, a new MBA program, it has to be possible to have it accredited by AMBER, let's say, because we think that's an important signal that we are a certain level of MBA, or it will allow us to achieve a certain kind of ranking score, and therefore there are certain technical requirements that we cannot ignore. We might, dare I say whatever happens, it has to have operations somewhere in it. It has to have finance or strategy in it. Now, we might say that because we believe that they're important subjects, or we might say cynically, if we don't, there's a chance we won't get accredited because proper MBAs teach you about those core subjects, and if we don't include them, we run risks. So technical requirements speak to the sort of, not really the deliverables, but sort of what are the minimum standards, if you will. Limits and exclusions within scopes are perhaps as important as what's in is what's out. Being really explicit about what you won't deliver in a project can reduce the likelihood of disagreements, bad feeling, potentially negative feedback, and of course in the extreme law cases and financial penalties, because people have different views on what was in and what was not in a project. And then the scoping of the project should also outline the timelines for the review with clients as you go along, and indeed at the end of the project. So that's one area. And of course, once you essentially know what the deliverables are, you start to break the work down. And we can sort of think of this as kind of like what's the DNA of a project? What are the key activities? What are the work packages? How do we define what needs to be delivered, what the cost is, what the resource is, who is responsible? Somebody in the Q&A earlier was talking about this sort of being very clear on responsibility. And that then links us to that third bubble. Are we clear about who is responsible overall for the project? Who is responsible for different kinds of work along the way? Who are we consulting with, or who are we informing? Who is essentially not just doing the work, but that we need to make sure knows of the work, and so we can use kind of responsibility matrices and things to think about that idea. But in some ways, that slide kind of implies something, and it sort of implies that project management is predominantly a technical activity. We take a project, we chop it up into the key ingredients, we think about what activities need to occur, we think about what the budget is for it, and what are the key measures of success, what are the technical requirements, what are the limits and exclusions, and voila, the project goes really well. But of course that isn't the case, because projects are, as much as anything, a socio-dynamic environment. They are heavily people oriented. And so when we think of project management as managing people, as opposed to essentially managing process, we can really get into some interesting ideas around stakeholders. So that leads me to another small little exercise. Now, again, as a sort of sidebar, if I were running this in a class, we might then at this point break you off into workrooms to get you working in teams of 4 or 5 to bounce around ideas of this. I might, if I had longer, be thinking about getting each team to then come back and present some of their ideas on stakeholders. We don't have time to do that here, but you can hopefully get the idea of the way in which some of these little exercises that we've done in a 3-hour class, one of course would expand those ideas, get into more discussion, get into more nuance with it. So we have a project. This project is called CLEAN, the Clean Supply Chain. It is operating in a hospital, and the hospital is looking to implement Lean, which is a kind of form of approach to operations excellence, something I do talk a lot about within the MBA class on managing operations and supply networks. But they're looking to implement that within healthcare, so they've decided to call it Clinical Lean, i.e. Clean, very imaginatively. And I want you to think about the stakeholders for this project, okay? So I want you just to type into the Q&A any stakeholders that you can think of for a project like this. If I'm looking to implement a new way of working within a hospital and within the supply network, who are some of the key stakeholders that I'm going to have to think about in engaging in that project, in consulting in that project, in involving in some way in that project, in trying to gain buy-in for that project? All right, so I'm just going to bring up here. Let's get some of your thoughts on this one then. Okay, so thank you. Let me just come down. Shada, a good start there. So hospital staff, and in fact we could be a little bit more specific than that perhaps. So let's think about specific types of staff, because the chances are different staff are going to have different views here, right? So let's think about a few more different ones. I got any more coming through? Who else have we got? I'm gonna pause and I'm gonna give you a chance to type in, because I know there's always a temptation just to let me kind of tell you the answer straight away. It also gives me a chance just to have a little micro pause for a second. Right, okay, Bogdan again, thank you, well done. So we've got regulators, we've got patients, we've got pension funds, very nice, doctors, equipment producers. Now, of course, when we start thinking about funders, different countries are going to have different setups in terms of, are these private hospitals, therefore insurance companies become really relevant. Is it essentially a national health service like we have in the UK? Therefore, it's perhaps rather more a stakeholder of government and as you say, regulators or various institutes that sort of manage and run the health system, for example. Equipment producers, really nice point. So, if I am moving towards a lean way of operating, that may have massive implications. In fact, it will have massive implications for the way in which I engage with suppliers. I might now be saying to suppliers, I don't want you to deliver this many products once a month or once a week. I actually want you to deliver this many products every day in a patterned way. So I want you to, essentially, because we're trying to speed up throughput in that case of the products, I don't want you to deliver them to one central store, because then I have lots of muda, waste of people walking back and forwards to go and collect the stuff. I actually want you to deliver this stuff to where it's needed so that nurses and doctors can get it when they need it. And that's a very different kind of distribution network, for example. Doctors, of course, and nurses and other technicians, the pharmacy department, the heads of different functions are going to have very strong views on this. Some people in this setting are going to be super keen on the idea, because they're going to say, you know what, ultimately lean is about delivering a higher value of service to customers. In this case, those customers being our patients. This is about ensuring that patients get the very best level of care, because we have the stuff we need when we need it in the right way, and we are using our resources effectively to spend time with patients rather than to be wasting time on non-value added activities. It's a common misconception of lean, as a side point, that it's all about cost saving. It isn't. Cost saving often just comes out of the process of looking for non-value added activity. So you think about that mindset of, if you think about your day, the stuff you do in it, how much of it is truly value added and how much of it is essentially a function of a process that doesn't really work very well, having to re-enter data from that system to that system. We all have it, right? Universities are no different from anywhere else. So that idea of what effect is it going to have on me as a doctor on my working day, on me as a nurse on my working day? Does that mean as a doctor, maybe I'm going to be expected to actually come in at weekends to discharge patients, so we don't have waste of patients waiting in a bed for longer than they need to be discharged? But I like my weekends. I like playing golf at the weekends. How's that going to work? So there are really interesting changes that might be required there. Carrying on down, LIAGUS regulatory bodies, Kerry-Ann, infection control, absolutely, because again, one of the concerns, likely as not, if you tell somebody in healthcare we're going to bring in lean and they don't really know it, they're going to think, oh, it's about cutting costs, cutting stuff, and therefore they're going to worry that might actually result in worse patient care, less safety, infections. Now, actually, that's a misunderstanding, for sure, but it's a common misunderstanding. And so if you are running head of infection control, you're probably not going to be going, yeah, let's do it, it's going to be great. You're probably going to be, at the very least, on what we think of as a sociodynamic framework. You're going to be a waverer. You're going to be somewhere in the middle with some views of some positive energy, what we call synergy towards a project, but also some antagonism, negative energy towards a project. And within that kind of idea of kind of sociodynamics, we can think about how different players in a project management ecosystem, if you will, have naturally different starting points, whether for your project or against your project. But many players in projects basically don't care, basically don't have strong opinions because they haven't been formed. So they start, in a sense, those are the ones to win over. And of course, if you're vehemently opposed to a project and you're trying to stop it, that's also what you're trying to do, is to try and influence to kind of make them less positive, and you're trying to influence to make them more positive. Suppliers of equipment, doctors, thank you. Procurement team, the finance team, absolutely. So, if you think about the procurement team, they might be being asked to work in very different ways. Maybe they're being asked to focus less on cost savings for their suppliers, but much more on high levels of reliability or more flexibility of suppliers. Maybe reducing supply base down so they can actually organize in a rather more partnership oriented mode rather than a transactional mode. So this project has massive implications for the whole way of doing work, and therefore all of these players become stakeholders. Finance may have quite a different perspective. They are kind of interested in, what's it going to do to the bottom line, and how are we going to assess those improvements, for example. Facilities, and the estates team might be saying, well, we quite liked having a central store for all this stuff. It was easy. And now you're saying, oh, we're going to have to move it to all these other places. Well, I'm going to have to get some extra trolleys. I'm going to have to get some extra people to do all of that. Can't the supplier do that? So you're going to get these kind of tensions between some players in a project will actually be worse off than they were before, but you're happy to do that because the overall improvement of the system is substantial. But we then have to think about how do we compensate, if you will, those parts of the system that suffer as a result of a project. It's just like if you're going to go and build down the road, you want to think about the people who are very nearby and try and minimize the disruption. You maybe don't allow your construction workers to work on a weekend because you don't want to annoy those stakeholders any more than you have to. Absolutely. Nurses, social workers, those who are kind of connected into these systems. Data, sensor data. So, a lot of the kind of technology that then supports this work, the technology providers become stakeholders, the internal IT teams become, the community leaders are really important because they represent other stakeholders. It's like trade unionists representing employees are key stakeholders because they have a voice of others. They also have their own voice, of course, and it's important when we consult and engage with stakeholders to kind of connect directly to the end stakeholders, not simply say, well, I've spoken to a community leader, therefore I know what everyone thinks. I'll give you a specific example of that in a project. I was recently advising on a project where the organization really wanted to use these kind of community leaders and trade union representatives as their kind of default go-to because it was easy. Essentially, it took less work to talk to a few key players than to speak directly. But the problem is that some of those representatives were very good at representing truly the population that they represent, and others were less so. So one of the community leaders essentially was a retired gentleman who had a very strong view that was his personal view about this project, that bore very little relationship to the community that he was representing, which was not all retired white men, but actually was a very diverse community and many, many families who actually weren't feeling like their voice was being heard at all. And so actually then the organisation carried on talking to these community leaders, but also ran some focus groups specifically with different groupings within that local community to really hear, well, what do the families think about this? What do young people think about this? What do women think about this, frankly, because this particular community leader had a very specific, dare I say it, a way of thinking, which was not representative in that regard. Yeah, so Jazz has talked about other service networks, emergency, ambulance, logistics services, pharmacies that contribute to the overall patient journey. You know, there's so many players here. Jazz, by the way, as a kind of note to others who are on this call, Jazz Kalra is a great colleague of ours. He worked here at Bath and is now actually working in industry, but he co-authored one of our latest case studies that are in the book around supply chain management and supply development. And so often when I'm using case studies in classes, some of them are ones that I've worked on, but there are also several that I've worked on with very good colleagues and friends where we bring in people's perspectives. So, you know, here at Bath, we have a really strong relationship with the Hinkley Point C facilities, the nuclear facilities, researching around supplier development and engagement. Colleagues Jens Rorik and Brian Squire particularly leading that, and Jens, and then various other postdoc researchers and PhDs. So we try, you know, we talk, this is a sidebar by the way, you know, but sometimes universities talk about the idea of, you know, research informed teaching, and you might think, well, what does that really mean? Does that mean that I'm going to walk in and just be given a whole ton of theory and I'm going to be totally bored? That's not what research informed teaching is, not if it's good. Research informed teaching is the fact that we as a School of Management are heavily engaged in very impactful, very important work, but we will then show how that work is relevant to you as well. So it's sort of, we'll share theories and frameworks when they're relevant, when they're useful to you and your development, rather than just to impress you with the fact we know some theories or we know these particular companies. A sidebar, but also a shout out to Jazz, who is a fantastic colleague and friend. All right, so I'm going to carry on a little bit further now, if I may, into this idea of, well, if we've now made a list in our minds of the stakeholders of a project like this, we need to start thinking about, so what? What do we do with that information? What do these stakeholders want? How do we engage with them in different ways? And so some of the theories that I use in project settings kind of link to some of the ideas I use in operations and supply chain, a very behavioral angle on perhaps sometimes what is quite a technical subject. So Fofis' theory of sociodynamics really speaks to the idea of how do you anticipate players' roles to change. So it's nothing to do with project management, actually. It's much more to do with you know, understanding group dynamics and when you approach change. But I've used this sort of perspective in thinking about project management often because it works really well. It works really well in several ways. One, because it speaks to the fact that sometimes stakeholders in projects are not just positive or negative, they're actually a bit of both. So you have many waverers in projects, for example, and these are the terms from Fofis' work, but waverers who, they can see some positives of what you want to do, but they also see some limitations and they don't really fully agree with aspects of your project. And so thinking about those waverers and understanding what is it that makes them wary. That means, of course, as an opponent who is perhaps rather more negatively predisposed towards a project, you need to think about how you might influence those waverers to draw them down and essentially to gain opposition. But similarly, if you are running a project, you need to influence them. Now, how do you influence them? Well, many projects are led by what we refer to as zealots, those who are vehemently in favour of a project. They think it's going to be brilliant. They become very immersed in it. We all find ourselves sometimes doing that. We find it hard to listen to dissenting voices because we see those dissenting voices as fundamentally challenging the very idea of a project rather than just a particular point of a project, a particular issue. And so they're very risky in a way because you need zealots, you need champions, you need energy, to drive a project forward, but sometimes they're quite risky to use them in certain very delicate environments, because they will basically say to a waverer who says, I'm not quite sure about this. They won't say, well, yes, that's an interesting perspective. They'll just say, well, you're an idiot. What are you talking about? This is going to be so good. How can you not see it? A golden triangle, by contrast, is what MBAs should be, and what good project managers should be, and what good managers generally should be, and what the very best CEOs are. Essentially, they have positive energy. They see positives in ideas, opportunities in ideas, but they also have a sort of healthy level of cynicism. They're open to the fact that they might not know the answer, that there might be other ideas. If you are working in a group on your MBA, try to be a golden triangle as much as you ever can. Try to imagine a world where you don't know everything, where actually there are other people in the group who might be quite quiet sometimes, who say, but what about this? And actually, rather than going, no, I'm the leader here, actually, they might have a really good point. That's something I'd encourage you to do a lot, because one of the challenges of an MBA program is, we put you in groups a lot of the time because we're replicating the real world, where you will be working in groups so much of your working life, where those group dynamics will make a big difference. And coming with an openness to how do you effectively work in your groups? How do you deal with differences of opinion? How do you move away from being kind of like, I'm right, you're wrong, to, well, actually, there are different opinions and they may all have interesting and useful, if we can embrace them, we can actually drive this project forward in a more successful way. So these ideas of, I'm not going to sort of go too much into the detail of every single element on this page here, but these ideas of project stakeholders and sociodynamics is really to say, do we understand answers to some of these key questions? What interest do these project stakeholders have in our work? What motivates them? What information do they want? What's the best way of communicating? What's their opinion currently? How could we influence their opinion? What are we going to do to win them round? If we can't win them round, how will we manage opposition? Effectively, we are trying to understand the idea that stakeholders may start somewhere on this playing board, if you will, but we have an ability to influence that playing board through better consultation, better engagement, better understanding of other players. Sometimes some of the best projects, the most successful projects, are ones who really truly understand opponents and look to understand how to give ground where they can, but hold ground and be quite open and transparent with that, who really understand differences in people who want to engage very fully in a project and those who just want to be kept informed, etc., etc. So these are all really interesting issues to consider. Now, finally, and I'm aware of time, Don, remind me, I think I've got till 10:30 local time, is that right?
10:30, yeah. Obviously, we'd like to have some questions. There are some questions.
Yeah, but absolutely. So that's pretty much perfect on my timing. I just wanted to make sure that I was right on that. So the final thing I want to talk about a little bit then is this idea of project learning. And I think it's a really underutilized aspect of projects generally. I also think, going back to now you as MBAs in an MBA project, I think it's something that you need to embrace much more, and you within the program. I don't mean people here don't embrace it. I mean it's a really important part of the Bath MBA, this idea of a learning mindset as you go. So when you are working on one unit, doing the work, working in groups, at the end of that, taking the time to sit down with that group who you may have fallen out with or you may have worked brilliantly with, and asking those questions of, okay, if we were doing this again, how would we as a group handle it differently? When we ended up having two of us on this side of the view and two on the other, were we effective in could we have done it differently? Were there times where we felt rushed to move to a decision and actually we should have stayed in planning mode for a bit longer because we actually had more time than we thought? Were there times where we felt that we were sitting in a room facing off against one another and we couldn't agree and we ended up just going with whoever shouted the loudest, when actually what we should have done is said, let's just go for a walk. Let's just go for a walk around the lake on campus. It's one of the most effective things you can ever do in a project that you're struggling, is go for a walk. You know, we talk about it with, you know, walk the dog, freeze your mind, get some fresh air. But the whole dynamic changes. When I go for a walk with a colleague, we're walking side by side, so we're naturally more collegiate than when we're facing off against one another. When I have a bit of time to talk about some other stuff, I start to see that there are connections that I hadn't imagined with this person who I'm working with that I can build on and work with. So these kind of ideas, you know, the old sort of phrase of, you know, if in doubt, go for a pint. It's an rather old-fashioned view, of course, because it assumed that everybody drinks alcohol, which of course they don't, and it assumes that that's a kind of good option. But the core idea behind if in doubt, go for a pint actually works really well, because what it's basically saying is, if in doubt, change the setting, change the dynamic, take some of the heat out of the environment, and then you may see things differently. Think about what your mum maybe used to say, sleep on it, you know, sleep on it. Well, that's another principle basically of like, don't answer an email when you're angry. You know, these are the same kind of basic principles of give yourself a bit of time, step back, look at the big picture. Don't be like Noah was, so focused on one little thing that he forgets to kind of step out and look at that big picture. So learning for me is something that's absolutely essential for good project work, and it's something that we really emphasize here at Bath, I think across the whole program actually, this idea of really seizing opportunities to learn from others, to learn from outside sources, to learn from outside of your sector, from outside of your country settings, to think differently about issues. And it's another thing I would kind of say again as a sort of slight sidebar of why an MBA rather than say a really specialist master's is so useful, because even if you have done a particular topic in great depth and you're an expert, you're still going to hear different views on it from the lecturers. You're still going to be exposed to different views because they're going to be sharing things from other sectors, other countries, academic perspectives that you haven't read on. And importantly, you're going to be hearing different views from your colleagues in the class. So I would really encourage anyone who thinks that, you know, they're, in a sense, the more you know about a subject, the more you realize you don't know about a subject. The more I learn about this wonderful subject of operations management, of supply chain management, of project management, the more I realize, gosh, I've got so much to learn, so many useful things. And so us as lecturers, one of the reasons we love teaching MBAs, truly, probably more than any other course, I have to be slightly cautious how I say that, but is because we walk into the room and we don't know what we're going to hear. We don't know the pushback we're going to get on certain things we say. We, if we're good, have an open mind to say, here's some ideas. Feel free to challenge. Challenge respectfully, challenge each other respectfully, but we are not setting ourselves up as like knowing everything, because we have a learning mindset ourselves as well as you do, and we try and, I guess, lead by example. So when we think about, you know, sources, coming back to this of project learning, we can learn based on what we've done and audit and review previous projects, but we can also learn from others. The external knowledge mindset for learning, in a way, it's saying, why make every mistake yourself and learn from it? Sometimes watch somebody else make a mistake, codify that knowledge, and then you basically save yourself the pain. So there's a combination. Sometimes people say, you know, you can only really learn by doing it and failing. There is some truth in that, but you can also learn by becoming smart in the way you observe the activities of others as well. And that builds to a kind of, again, a new visual from one of our recent books around project learning, where we see fundamentally two types of project organizations. Organizations that run their project as if they're essentially one-off, highly customized, unique, therefore there's nothing to learn from one to another, because that's what projects are, right? And the problem with that mindset is it implies that everything about a project is unique, which of course is a nonsense. And therefore your performance sometimes is good, sometimes is less good. And that's based on a combination of who's running that project, are they good or not? What kind of team have they got? What kind of project are they facing? And what kind of luck do they experience along the way? But the underlying performance sort of stays flatlining. Compare that with a true learning operation or organization when it comes to projects, and you see the idea of really codified processes that, really established processes that codify learning logs, time allocated at the very start of the process for stepping away from the project to do learning workshops, for example, time allocated to have a post-project review with certain members of the team, etc., etc. Resourcing that, importantly, seeing that it's a cost, but the benefit is so high. And what we then see is, again, projects vary in their performance, of course, because some projects just face a tougher environment. They just get hit by Brexit, or they get hit by a supplier who is based in Eastern Europe, and at the moment that creates a challenge. So there are some things that are out of our control and performance might be lower, but the average performance continues to rise because essentially you have organizations that are learning from their mistakes, learning from others, have a mindset to the value of connecting from one project to the next, to the next. So I finished with this particular visual. You remember my initial example. Well, this is what happened the following day. This was Noah working on a new project, which is actually a more complex, more involved project, which of course tells us something that, you know, sometimes in project management, we have to start with simple projects and then learn from them and then build up. And a project that seems overwhelmingly complex or overwhelmingly innovative or overwhelmingly time pressured actually isn't overwhelming to a professional project manager, because essentially they've done it before. So every project manager who's brilliant once started as a learner. In fact, you know, that broad idea of every expert in anything once was new to it, right? But the second thing you can see here is there's no cat. And that's because Noah came down that morning. I mean, every morning he was getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning, and me heading downstairs. And the first thing he said is, "Daddy, where's Millie?" It's like, well, I don't know, he said. And then he walked to the door, shut the door, and then checked that it was locked and said, no Millie this time. So he'd learned from that failure and he'd prevented Millie. In addition, I said to him, "Oh, why have you let Barney in then?" "Barney's a good dog. Barney will make sure the cats don't come in." So he had two ways. He'd stopped the failure essentially, but he also had a new monitoring device in Barney, who was just watching the project while he was getting on with bits and pieces. So we can always learn from these failures as we go along. So I hope you found that an interesting session, and I hope you've kind of picked up some of these ideas of how we're approaching different topics at Bath, how we sort of think about different issues, I guess, in a slightly different way, slightly more critical way than simply just teaching topics. So there's a combination on an MBA, of course, of covering core subjects and teaching the basics of marketing, the basics of strategy or finance or everything else. But there's also a huge amount of playing with those ideas and saying, just what I taught you could be seen as total rubbish in various different ways, and let's play with it and explore it. And that's something to really embrace, I think, when you come on any MBA, but particularly the Bath MBA, that idea of bringing your own ideas with you to share, but also bringing a good amount of space to let ideas in to me. So there we are. Thank you. Thank you, Jazz.
That's fantastic. Yes, indeed. Thanks to you for a brilliant session, and thanks to our audience who have been supplying lots and lots of valuable interactions. So despite the difficulties of doing this online, it's been brilliant. There are several questions, so some of which are there, some of which have come through different channels.
So I can see a couple here. So maybe shall I have a look at some of the ones there, or do you want to fire them up? I saw one on Michelle about an academic textbook that you'd recommend if you were to only buy one. Now that's a tricky question, because I don't know kind of how broad you're thinking, Michelle, of like, if there was just one book in the whole world that I would buy, or one sort of project management book. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, there are various kind of textbooks on project management. So Harvey Mailer's book on project management is a pretty good starter, I would argue. That's quite a nice one. There's also some of the stuff by, it's more of a book by Drov Dvir and Shenhar around the diamond model, which is sort of speaks to this idea of a contingency perspective on projects. In truth, and this is in no disrespect to project management scholars, I've yet to find like a project management book that I absolutely love, because some of the project management books take a fairly traditional view of projects and don't maybe bring in some of the ideas of stakeholders and behavioral as much as I think they should, or they maybe don't bring in some of the ideas of agile versus traditional projects. So kind of this idea of contingency thinking in projects. A project that's running in a highly volatile environment, lots of complexity and ambiguity and innovation, needs to be organized quite differently from some of the more traditional projects. Both are important. I think if you were kind of looking slightly broader of, you know, books around operations and projects and supply chain, then actually I would say that, you know, one of our books is not a bad place to start. I mean, of course I'm biased because I'm an author, but I think what we've tried to do with something like operations and process management, which is particularly aimed at an MBA space, that version of our book, what we've tried to do is think quite carefully about the sort of information that executives want, quite practical, quite applied, not kind of too academic language, but actually informed. So it's kind of, again, it speaks to that idea of research informed books. So they don't lack rigor, but they don't spend too long trying to impress the reader by giving you loads and loads of references, because it's not that kind of book, you know. So that could be quite a good place to start. But then there's also, you know, really short books like Nigel Slack, who's obviously a co-author on the book, wrote a really great book called The Operations Advantage. That's more of the book you read when you're at the airport on your flight, and that's very much purely aimed at practitioners, written in a very different style. But that's a really great read, and you know, that's kind of like you can read it on a flight to the States and back again kind of book. Yeah, PMP certification required after completing your MBA. Good question. So on certifications, we don't provide certification around project management. Most MBAs don't, frankly, Diksha. Sometimes if there are MBAs where you have a specific, quite long elective on project management, you will get not even then a certification, but you will get an exemption from parts of either Prince 2 or PMP or PMBOK. So when you go to them, you can say, this is my pre-learning of the stuff I have done. And they'll say, oh, well, in that case, you don't have to do modules 1 and 2 of our 8-module certification, for example. So I could kind of get into a bit more detail, but in broad terms, no, but that's pretty common across most MBAs. Okay, John, I'll let you maybe throw some questions
sure.
out.
There's a question from somebody anonymous saying, how important is the knowledge of Lean Six Sigma in supply chain management, and will the MBA curriculum cover it?
Yes, is the answer. So we do quite a lot on Lean Six Sigma within my course on managing operations supply networks. It also gets covered to a degree in relation to the supply chain management elective as well. So again, there's a balancing act here. You know, I have in the past for executive audiences, you know, run a 4-day course on Lean Six Sigma. I've even done a longer and thinner, you know, evening executive course purely on Six Sigma and, you know, black belt and you know, that sort of stuff, right? That is not what the MBA is, because if you want to, say, for example, become a Six Sigma operative, well, there are any number of practice-based kind of courses you can do, and you can do alongside an MBA, frankly, where you can, you know, become a green belt or become a white belt and so forth. What you won't get with those, in a sense, is to really understand Lean and Six Sigma in the context of operations and supply more broadly, which is kind of what the MBA does. It sort of speaks to how do you understand the fundamentals of these improvement philosophies, essentially. How do you understand the kind of challenges of implementing these things from a behavioral perspective, rather than literally what is it? So there are lots of, but one of the other things it's probably worth saying is there is no one keener on any subject than the person in front of you in the room normally, because it's their subject. And so if you as a student, I've had students come up to me I never have lunch breaks or coffee breaks when I'm teaching MBAs, because basically I'm always bouncing and chatting away with colleagues, and I'm staying for, you know, an hour after sessions because I enjoy it. But I have never yet had someone who kind of comes to me and I'll say, well, sorry, I didn't cover that, tough luck. almost always it'll be, wow, well, if you want to know more, I'll send you this stuff and I'll send you that link. And I post a lot of, operations in practice on Moodle. So there'll be sometimes limits to what we can cover in a class, but one can always kind of point you in the direction of further deepening of any of these topic areas, for example.
There's no limit to what you can learn. There are numbers of questions which are about the program and scholarships and applications. We'll leave those because Becky's on the chat and we'll take some of them. But just before both you and I have to leave, there's a couple of questions that have come in from other areas.
Right.
A macro question: do you think project management is becoming more important nowadays?
Yes, 100%. But I'll tell you why, in a sense. I think one, because in the past, you tended to see project management as a kind of discipline that project managers did that stuff over there, and then there were kind of steady state managers who managed the rest. That just isn't the case. So we talk about this kind of term, which I actually hate the term, because projectification, because you can add isation or ication to everything, and it's sort of, I don't love the word, but the idea is, as organizations are increasingly operating more in project mode more of the time, much of our daily working lives, even if we're technically, the manager of X, will be, I'm doing 3 days of various different projects over here, and I'm doing 2 days of kind of the steady state-ish, if there is such a thing, operations. So I think knowing project management for everyone matters, those sort of principles, which is why I think the embedding of the multi-project suite within the MBA, and I would also add that Don didn't earlier, which is within each of the units, pretty much you're doing project work, because most of the units have, group activities where you're going off and doing, so I do almost like a mini consulting exercise in operations, where you go and pick an operation somewhere in Bath and you engage with the client if you possibly can, and you collect data and you present that like a mini consulting case. So I think that kind of project orientation has fundamentally shifted. I think the other thing, Don, is just people have finally got fed up with just how many projects fail. And I think it's a little bit like there are certain times where disciplines just get the airtime, and I think right now operations, supply chain, project management is getting more airtime, because if you look at businesses that are successful, it's bluntly not just because they've got a great service or product and they're good marketing. I mean, my colleagues might disagree with that, but very often it's because they're just delivering what they promise. They're actually doing what they say they're going to do. And, any amount of amazing branding and insight into the psychology of customers is basically worthless if you can't actually deliver what you say. And that, to me, is what that I'm into speaks to, is like, yeah, well, let's actually deliver these promises and make it a reality.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. I know from this question chimes with me. I know from my own background working in advertising that the creation, development, implementation, and then delivery of an advertising campaign is a major project. But there's a huge paradox and tension within that between the creativity and therefore the requirement for flexibility and innovation versus the more structural or strategic parts of it. And very often that results in clashes. I wonder if you can enlarge on that.
Yeah, really good point. And it's something I get into a bit actually with, I think, operations management broadly as a subject, as I say, which incorporates project space, incorporates the extended view into supply networks. I think sometimes it's seen as the less creative part of the business, frankly, and there is some truth in that. If you just look at the kinds of people who go into these different careers, often, the true creatives often do go into the innovation space. They do go into marketing positions. So it's not, generalizations are risky, but there's often a grain of truth in them, for sure. And I think what that then means is, actually, for me, a lot of the work I do around kind of the marketing operations interface is, how can you get people who work predominantly in marketing to truly understand how it works and to become aware that this matters. If you keep saying to clients, yeah, I'm sure that'll be fine, just sign here, at some point it's going to come back to bite you, because customers say, well, you promised all this and it hasn't emerged. And you can shout all you like at the people in the kind of the back office, in inverted commas, but at some point you're going to take the blame for that as well. But similarly, in the other direction, a lot of the work I do with operations people is actually getting them to think more creatively, to work in more creative spaces, and that's sometimes a matter of just structuring time differently and saying, yeah, you don't have to just pick your first answer and start to execute. Actually, you need to give more time, say in a project, for coming up with crazy ideas. You know, one of the exercises I do actually more with an undergraduate project, because I teach project management to some undergraduates in engineering. Occasionally they kind of work across with the management school, is you know, we'll talk about you know, what are your uses for a chair, you know, and you'll start with, you know, you sit on it and you can, the obvious things, and then I just go like, well, that's not enough, you know, I want more, give me more. And then slowly people start to get creative. Oh, you could use it as a piece of modern art, you could use it as a weapon, you could use it as an umbrella, and you know, you get crazy ideas coming out, and slowly, you know, you get, basically you say, I'm not stopping until we've got 100 ideas on this board. And then you can really speak to some of the ideas of who naturally kind of run out of ideas sooner or later, and therefore when you think about building a project team, you need to explicitly hire combinations of true creatives, true structured types, and a bit of a mix in between, because otherwise, if you've only got creatives, it's why a lot of, you know, movies and art projects go so badly wrong, because they have a slight over dominance of people who can't then actually just get on and make it happen, which is why you actually get really good producers and directors who aren't always that creative. Ironically, they're good at making things move forward. Or you get really unimaginative projects over here because they go, oh well, these people, they're not really like me, I don't know if I want them in my team. So there's an irony here. You talk about, you know, team group cohesion. Sometimes you need disagreement and friction in a team to make it work, because if your team is all, everyone agrees, I would argue that your team isn't the right mix in that sense. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, listen, I think that we probably need to hand over to Becky, because there's lots of questions about all this stuff. So Al, huge thanks for that. Yeah. Brilliant stuff.
And can I just say one other thing just before I go on mute, which is, firstly, thank you folks for listening. I hope you found it interesting. Do reach out to me, you know, on LinkedIn. That's always a nice way to kind of start getting a sense of who we are. You know, I use LinkedIn quite a lot just to kind of keep people in up to date with what we're doing, and also I love to hear what other people are doing. I've got lots of, you know, MBA alums over the years who kind of tell me about new jobs and everything else. So if you are, you know, if you'd like to, it'd be lovely to connect in that way. All right, thanks everybody.
Brilliant, thank you. Becky, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Al. That was amazing. And it gives everyone who is on this call and maybe looking at these recordings later really good insight into how our MBA academics really inspire all of our students who take part on the programme. So masses of thanks to you, Al. So hello to everyone who is on this call. I'm here to answer any questions you have about the MBA. That's the full-time 12-month MBA that we run, as well as the executive part-time 2-year MBA. That's the EMBA. So I'll just outline really quickly some of the differences in both of the different programs, and then answer some of the questions that are coming up in the chat box as we go along. So the full-time 12-month program starts in September. We are still taking a few applicants. We are pretty full, to be fair, for this year's entry. There are a few spaces left, so you're very welcome to get in touch with me individually, and we can talk through whether it's right for you to join this year. It's quite late in the process, so it may be actually that it's better for you to join in September 2023. But like I say, very happy to have that conversation with you. The executive part-time MBA is also starting in September, so that one will start a little bit earlier than the full-time. With the executive MBA, what will happen is that you will be joining the class that started last September, so you'll have the benefit of joining them, and then next year when they finish, you will then have the new class that you'll be joining. So you'll have the benefit of 3 different cohorts altogether through the EMBA. The full-time MBA, it's just your class, your cohort. So the class sizes, that's always an interesting question for us. Generally speaking, the full-time MBA program has around 45 to 50 students on it. So we keep it as a quite small class. As you heard through Al's presentation, we do loads of group work. So you'll be working in small groups. You'll get to know everyone on the program really, really well. Thing to remember with an MBA is that these are lifetime connections that you're going to be making. So it's really important that you get to work with everyone in your class to get to know them really, really well, and to use them as your sort of sounding board for the future. So that's the full-time class. We have, like I say, it's up to about 50 students. We have nationalities from all over the world. I think the current class, we've got about 15 different nationalities. So that gives you a really good idea of the diversity you'll be meeting within the classroom. The average age, it's normally around sort of 29 years old up to about 32 years old. So within that, you'll see that people are bringing lots of different experiences. And again, as Al mentioned in his presentation, a lot of the group work is actually about you bringing that experience into the classroom. So you'll be using your experiences from your particular industry backgrounds to actually help determine and make conversations with the other people on your group projects. Industry wise, we recruit from lots and lots of different industries. So it could be that you'll be sitting with people who have worked in marketing, or they've come through the software development side. They could be architects. So really diverse industry backgrounds and experiences. And the people who tend to come on the full-time program quite often are people who maybe want to set up their own business. So they might be entrepreneurs in the making. They may already have a business and want to sort of develop that business idea. They may be career changers. So this is where somebody maybe has come up through a marketing background who thinks, actually, I want to swap and maybe work more in supply chain, for example. So we work very closely with people who want to do that career switch. Maybe that you want to change industries. Or it may be that actually you just want to accelerate your career in your chosen industry. And again, an MBA is a brilliant way of doing that, because the broadness of what you'll be learning through all the different aspects of a business is really, really key for your own personal development in the future. So, so those are some of the reasons people come onto the programs. I know that there's always a question around funding and scholarships, so I'll answer that question. So we do have some scholarships. The one thing I always recommend is that you make sure that you have the finances in place before you make your application. There's little point in you putting so much effort and energy into doing your application if you can't afford the program. The scholarship is a nice to have. It's a lovely thing to achieve, but only some of the class will achieve the scholarship. So I always do encourage you to be very, very clear that you can afford our program without a scholarship. And if you do get the scholarship, that's great.
Becky, can I just chuck in
yes,
one
Al.
thing here on this,
Yeah.
which is also just to say, always think about the long-term value of anything, right? And MBAs are no different. If you think of it as an investment, it is an absolute bargain. And this is nothing to do with Bath MBAs. This is a broader point of like doing an MBA generally. When you think about the kind of differential salaries, and not just salaries, but opportunities that an MBA gives you over your whole future career, these are really, really substantial. And so, at the time, it can feel like a lot of money to pay for any MBA, frankly, and I completely acknowledge that. But I would encourage people to take a long view on it. I'd also say, even without scholarships, there are also other forms of financing that exist, and there's a lot of information on the website, and Becky can help on advising around sort of loans, crowdsourcing loans, etc., which can essentially spread the cost of that pain, frankly. So just as to chuck it in as well, sort of try never to let the cost stop you doing something that could be hugely valuable for you.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, that's a brilliant point. This MBA, your experiences on the program are going to last you throughout your working life. So it is really key to not just see the very short-term pain or what you'll be doing in the very short term, but look at it over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years of your working career. Again, yes, Al said on the website, we do have lots of information about different funding. So we work with some companies to look at how you can fund your MBA, but we're very happy to talk to you about that separately on a case-by-case basis. The full-time MBA, I think the sort of key difference that we offer, which again Al has alluded to in his presentation, is the multi-project suite. So this is a series of 4 consultancy style projects. Now, that makes it sound as if we only do 4 projects. We don't. We do constant projects throughout all of the teaching. So every academic who teaches on the programme will be bringing in their own projects, case studies, things like that for you to work on throughout the programme. We have 4 consultancy style ones where you'll actually be linked directly with a real life business contact with a real life business problem that you will be then asked to get the briefing from the client about what it is that they're actually looking for, and then present back to the client with some solutions. And in some instances, you're then able to implement that in the business. So you'll actually see the direct change and impact that you will have on that business as you go through the year. So it's hugely exciting to actually take the theory of what you're learning in the classroom and put a practical application to it. And we think that that's absolutely critical for an MBA, because actually this is what you're going to be doing in the real workplace. So you'll get that experience, you'll get the failures as well as the successes in that, which is really, really important. That's all part of your learning journey. And the feedback from the clients as well as from your peers. So you'll be very much in that space where you'll be getting really critical but important feedback from different stakeholders, different people through that whole process. So that's a really engaging part of our offering at Bath. Yeah, let me just see if there's any specific other questions that have been asked. So,
Becky, there was one, by the way, just about sort of, what does a typical class look like, which I quite liked. I don't know if I can very quickly jump in on that one. In some senses, there's no such thing as a typical class, partly because every academic has a different mindset about how they want to approach their subject, different topic areas, different levels of embracing forms of pedagogy. So for example, I do have quite a lot of experiential exercises. Others maybe go, I really like using videos. Some people have some really long, deep cases where you then explore off it. I might use lots of short case boxes. So I think the truth is there isn't a typical class, and that's a good thing, right? Because in some senses, diversity is helpful because different people learn in different ways. What I think I would say is a kind of consistent theme, though, is the people that are teaching here are genuinely very knowledgeable. You are kind of being taught by people who are writing about this stuff rather than essentially people who are reading others' interpretation. And so sometimes people do say like, oh well, why should I go to a research intensive institution? We yesterday the UK's research excellence framework, we came 7th out of 108 in the UK, so kind of alongside it's really top end places. But why would you go to a Bath or a Warwick or an Imperial or LSE or Cambridge, frankly? Well, one of the reasons is because actually those are the kinds of places that are generating many of these ideas rather than essentially taking the ideas. And so that would be something I would say is a real strength.
Thanks, Al. That's great to have your input on that. Thank you. So yeah, there is really no typical class. We can talk about statistics about ages, industries, things like that. But actually, when you're researching your MBA, which university you're going to be going to, which business school you want to go to, then it is about the class size, the class makeup, the way the program is designed, the way it's delivered. So ours is a very practical program. So you're using that theory in the classroom and putting it in a practical application throughout the whole of the 12 months with us, or the 2 years if you're on the executive program. So these are some of the things that you should be considering. Obviously, we're very lucky that we are in Bath. It's a beautiful city, UNESCO World Heritage Site. The campus is a campus-centric university, so that means that everything happens on campus. So your accommodation is in the city centre, so you'll go off campus for the end of the day, but everything, once you're up on campus, is in one place. And you know, again, that suits some people because actually you don't want to be necessarily walking across the city to find your lunch or to go to the library. Everything is in one place in Bath. So again, that's something the community feel to think about when you're choosing your university. Bath is very international, both the city and the university. We're very used to having students here. So it's a very welcoming and it's a very safe city to come and study in. It's a small city. We have a river and a canal going through the middle of us. So it's a beautiful space. It's lots of nature. The university is situated on top of a hill. We are surrounded by green fields. So that's also something to consider about your mental and personal well-being. That space is really important, especially if you are moving away from home, maybe for the first time, coming to a different culture. So making sure that you've got that sense of both security, but that community around you. And I will say that is something that we are very good at through the whole of the application process, is actually helping you, making sure that you're choosing the accommodation that suits you, making sure that we're here to help you with things like visa questions. All the practical side of coming to a university is important, and it takes the stress away from you if you know you've got people like myself, like Pinar, who's on this call at the moment, and Emmanuel, who works in the admissions space, to make sure that you've got us to ask those questions too. So we're always very, very happy to have one-to-ones with you. Once you're on that MBA journey, whether it's on the executive one or the full-time, you'll have the chance to connect with me both individually, but also coming together as a group. So you're beginning to actually build up that network very early on in the process. So by the time you join us in September, you've already met online, sometimes face-to-face, a number of your colleagues who will be joining the class as well. And I think that's a really lovely way to start coming into the program, actually already knowing each other. So when you start with us, you're ready to go straight away into the classroom learning, which is really exciting.
Becky, I was going to again maybe add another one. There's been a couple of questions that sort of link to, you know, can I do this maybe in the summer? Can I do that? You know, essentially it speaks to a sort of theme of what flexibility is there. And maybe I could speak to that as sort of the ex-associate dean who did a lot of the work on some of the program that you see now. Of course, the program has continued to evolve and change and have new cool things all the time, right? But there's something about this idea of how flexible should an MBA be, and here you have kind of quite important choices when you're thinking about different MBAs. And again, I know most people on this call are coming anyway, or are fairly strongly decided, but I think as a broad point, some MBAs are fairly fixed in what you do, and there are some advantages of that. You know, you can have a cohort where you basically all do the same thing, and you're forced to do stuff you maybe wouldn't choose because actually sometimes doing things you don't think are useful turn out to be useful. So there is some benefit of just a fairly fixed course, and you build a cohort dynamic in that way. The alternative is you try and create a reasonably customized program where, you know, you either have one of two routes. The first route is lots of core with a small amount of space for elective, but absolutely loads and loads of electives. So some of the American MBAs, they'll say you can pick literally from 1,000 electives across the whole university. Essentially, you can pick any course that's running on the university, undergraduate, masters, but you can pick two of 1,000 at an extreme. There's one that I remember when they did the review of a leading institution does that. So it's high customization at one level, but of course you've only got 2 slots, and that's the problem. The alternative is you actually build space for electives across your program as a proportion. So I would argue, and I did at the time, that Bath is one of the most customizable programs in the world because we have about nearly 1/3 of all of the credits. So basically the elective space, not quite, but nearly 1/3 of the whole space is effectively free for you to make choices. So although you're not making choices from 1,000 electives, you're making choice from more like 20 or 30, you have a lot of freedom in terms of being able to pick lots of different things that kind of really tailor the program to you. A second thing I'd say about sort of flexibility is, you know, we look, because it's a small cohort, the whole program is designed to essentially be around 50 to 60 students at any time. That means we can customize it to individual needs. We can tailor things. We have coaching, we have mentoring that actually we genuinely know each individual student and what they're trying to do. So I had, in the past, a couple of students who had seen that there was a really interesting MSc unit on a slightly more advanced business analytics thing that would never have been on an MBA. It wouldn't have been appropriate for that. But who said, is there any chance we can maybe just sit in on a few classes? And of course, we can make those things happen because we're not, we haven't got 300 MBAs where you can say, well, sorry, that we can't operationally do that. So I think that's just something to say generally is, there of course are limits to what we can do, but it's a very flexible program from a structure perspective because of the design, but also because the cohort size means we truly get to know the needs of individuals. We can truly say, look, you did this negotiation class and you feel you need more, so let's think about setting something up where we'll bring somebody in to do that. Or there's some peer-to-peer opportunity where we can identify an excellent alumni who's done the thing you're about to do. Let's bring them in and get them to talk to you. So that's just another thing to say.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true, the way that we connect people. So once you've connected with me, if you're looking to connect with other students who are currently on the program or who are alumni who've gone through the process that you're hoping to go through, then we can make that connection for you and leave you to then talk in a much more honest and open way, I suppose, so get their real opinion on what they did learn through the program. And I think the other thing that sort of Al sort of vaguely touched on within that conversation is the careers team. So our career support is actually embedded in the program. It's not an add-on, it's actually part of the program itself, which is really key actually, because you're coming into the MBA program to look at your career for the next, like I say, 5, 10, 20 years. And having that career support from the very start, people who get to know you very, very well, who can help you not only interpret job descriptions in the UK job market, but actually look at your CV, look at your LinkedIn profile, give you connections with alumni, make the connections with business consultants that we bring into the program. So as Al said, every academic will have their own connections. Some of those will be businesses that they'll bring in, and you'll be encouraged to meet up with them, make that connection, and see what opportunities there are in that space. And that career support is there for 3 years after you graduate. Which is really exciting. You may decide to do an internship at the end of the program. So we do have a number of either 3 or 6 month internships that we offer to students. These are brilliant for people who are either swapping a career path, swapping an industry, and they just want to get a little bit of traction within that industry, or people who just aren't used to the UK job market. It's a really great way to just try that out. And then, of course, throughout that process, not only are you building up your CV and your skills and your experiences, but you're also linking back to the careers team to say, right, what's next? What am I going to go on to next? So that career support is critical, and you'll also have access to a mentor and an executive coach. Again, these are really amazing resources for you to really drill into what you want. We have a lot of people who come on the program who say, oh yeah, I want to go into consultancy. And then they learn about what consultancy is and they say, actually, maybe I don't quite want that, but I'm not sure what I do want. And again, talking to the careers team, talking to the academics, and talking to your coaches and mentors is a really good way to explore actually where your skill sets lie and what that might look for you. Again, either immediately or in 5, 10, 15 years down the line.
Becky, you've had a question saying, do you still take applicants for the 2022 intake? I mean, I know that the numbers are pretty strong and established, but are there still any spaces left?
Yeah, we are pretty full, it has to be said. We've pretty much got our class established. It's always worth having a conversation with us on a one-to-one basis before you put an application in, and we can talk to you about whether the entry this year is going to be possible or not. We've been really wonderfully successful in getting the fact that our program is so very interesting for so many people that we have pretty much filled all our spaces. But like I say, we're very happy to have conversations with people on an individual basis, even if that may be saying, well, let's consider you joining September 2023. Let's see what that might look like. But please just get in touch individually with me. And you could do it. I think Pinar's put some email addresses in the chat box. or you can connect with me on LinkedIn or through the website. Plenty of ways to get in touch with us. You will find lots of information on the website. The one thing I will say is the connection that you'll make with either myself or with the current students or alumni will actually give you the deeper breadth. The website can give you so much information, but actually that one-to-one personal connection is really, really important when you're making these decisions. So whichever universities you're looking at throughout the world, make sure you're connecting with students who've been through that program to get their take on it. Talk to people like myself to find out whether the structure, what we deliver, how we deliver it is right for you, and get those personal stories, which is really, really key to making your decision.
And actually, if I may just add that one point as well on that, which is something I used to say when I would be interviewing MBAs. I haven't done some of the interviews for the last kind of couple of years, but I've regularly done interviewing of MBAs or just talking to MBAs about, or being prospective MBAs. There's nothing worse than trying to oversell a program, because ultimately it's not good for you and it's not good for us if this isn't the right fit. And so those conversations in some cases do lead people to say, well, actually, I think that isn't the route. I now realize that maybe an MBA generally isn't the right route. I need to do a specialist master's because I definitely have a specific direction and I'm going to go down that route instead. Or actually, the more I'm thinking about it, the more I think that for another reason, another institution is going to be right for me because they have a slightly different orientation, a slightly more finance orientation. For example, with a couple of the London MBAs, they're sort of in our gang, maybe like Imperial as an example. And I'm not trying to say, oh, go to Imperial, not Bath, but I do think it's important to say we're different to others, and therefore for most people who are on this call, that's going to be a good different, because there's probably a reason you're here, but it's also kind of just constantly thinking, we wouldn't want you to come to Bath if the right place. And I have said to people sometimes in the past, and it's quite hard to do you know, I actually think you might be happier at X. And I do that because actually I think we owe it to you as individuals, spending all this money, investing your time, your effort, moving sometimes your families. This is a big challenge in your life. We owe it to you to help you make the right decision, even if ironically the right decision isn't to come to Bath.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say that in front of Becky as the recruitment manager, but given that we're nearly full anyway, maybe it's a fairly low risk thing to say, but yeah.
No, absolutely, and I do think that is critical, and that is why I'm here and why the other students are here to make sure that the journey you're going on is the right one for you as well as the right one for us. So it has to work both ways. But I think that's possibly it. So thank you so much to Al for your insights, both through the presentation and also adding to this chat. It's been great to have you with us through this.
There's someone that just quickly asked, what's the average age of the cohort?
Yeah, so for the full-time MBA, it tends to be around 30 years old, roughly speaking. For the executive MBA, it tends to be more like the sort of mid-40s, early 40s, that sort of band. But again, within any of these, there are parameters either side. So get in touch with us and we can talk to you about whether, you know, if you're sitting between the full-time and the executive MBA, we can talk to you about the benefits of both programs and see exactly, you know, which one would benefit you more. So get in touch. So thank you very much for all of your time, for all of the attendees, for all the support and team behind us today. And thank you very much to Al again for your amazing masterclass. Really enjoyed it. So thank you to everybody, and we hope to see you all again soon.
See you in September, everybody. Bye for now.